Greetings, dear brothers and sisters. So this time of year, in the lead up to Christmas, there often is a lot of confusion and division in regards to the topic of Christmas. Should Christians be celebrating Christmas? Is Christmas pagan in origin? Should we be having Christmas trees up? Where did Santa Claus come from? This kind of thing. So we're going to clarify a few things here in this study. And in order to bring some clarification, we always need to go back to the very beginning, don't we? So please turn to Genesis chapter 10 from verse 8, which says, Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, first thing to note there is that the word before the Lord, in the Hebrew, this is a mistranslation. In the Hebrew, it literally means in the face of. So what it should be translated as, a mighty hunter in opposition to the Lord. He was not before the Lord, he was in opposition to the Lord. Now we know this because the name Nimrod itself means we shall rebel. In Hebrew, the word for rebel is marad, and if you put an N in front of it, it becomes we shall rebel. So we shall rebel literally is Nimrod. Verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. So this entire area here, which Nimrod founded, was known in the ancient world as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the ancient name for this part of the world. The Hebrew equivalent for this part of the world was known as Shinar, as we just read here. Shinar. Shinar in Hebrew literally means tooth of the city. And we know from Daniel chapter 1 that Shinar is in the land of Babylon. So Shinar and Babylon are one in the same. It is in the land of Assyria, which is called the land of Nimrod, which we see in Micah chapter 5 verse 6. So the land of Assyria is associated with the land of Nimrod, and it's all known as Shinar in Hebrew. And of course in Genesis chapter 11, we know that it is in the land of Shinar where the Tower of Babel was built. It was Nimrod and his followers and descendants who built the Tower of Babel. Now we know from Josephus in Antiquities that one of the reasons that the tower was built, which we don't see in scripture, but we know from Josephus Antiquities that one of the reasons the tower was built was to avoid another flood, so that they would escape another flood if ever the Lord flooded the world again. Again, it's all living in rebellion and opposition to God. It's what the name Nimrod means. So the word Babel in Hebrew means confusion. That's why the Lord came down and confused the languages of the people when they was building the Tower of Babel. And of course, Babel is where Babylon comes from. The word Babylon comes from Babel, the Tower of Babel. This essentially is the birthplace of false religion. It all comes from Babylon, and it always keeps its name of origin as well. So, for example, you have the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, Great Scotland Yard in Victorian times. It was in a street called Great Scotland Yard. But now, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police is no longer in this street called Great Scotland Yard. It's now about half a mile away near the Houses of Parliament. However, the Metropolitan Police is still known as Scotland Yard. Why? Because it keeps its name of origin. And this is exactly how it works in the Bible. False religion is always known as Babylonian, even though it might not actually come from Babylon. Everything originates from Babylon when it comes to false religion. So it always goes back to the beginning and it keeps its name of origin, doesn't it? So that's how it works in the Bible, just like it works in any other walk of life. So this is where false religion began, Babylon, the Tower of Babel. We know also from historical sources such as Eusebius and also the Epic of Gilgamesh that Nimrod married his mother, Semiramis. Also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is said that Gilgamesh and Nimrod were one in the same. They were the same person. Now Nimrod, as I said, married his mother, Semiramis. Semiramis was known in the Babylonian world as Ishtar. Ishtar, that's where we get the word Easter from. That's a whole other topic we won't go into today. But Semiramis became known as Ishtar in the Babylonian world. And also, Ishtar is the one who is given the title the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven. This is something we see in Jeremiah 44, verses 16 to 17. They were worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And of course, who is given the title of Queen of Heaven now? It's Mary, isn't it? Mary. When Catholics worship Mary, they're not actually worshipping Mary, they're worshipping Ishtar, or they're worshipping Semiramis. They're not worshipping Mary. Mary's dead. They're worshipping these demon gods, as it says in the Bible. Demons are false gods, aren't they? 4 times the Bible says that other gods are demons. Now, after Nimrod's death, it was said that Nimrod went to possess the sun. He went to live in the sun. His spirit resided in the sun. And that is how sun worship came about. They started worshipping the sun because it was said that Nimrod went to reside in the sun. Now, one of the things that Semiramis claimed was that she conceived a child supernaturally. Who does that remind you of? She conceived a child supernaturally through the rays of the sun, and that this child that she conceived was the reincarnation of Nimrod. And this child was born on the 25th of December, and the child's name was Tammuz. Tammuz. Tammuz is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, it was said that Tammuz died and rose from the dead. Again, who does that remind you of? And they would often mourn for his death, and this is what the women are doing here in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14. They're mourning for Tammuz. Now, Tammuz, as I said, was born on the 25th of December. It was not the birth of Christ, it was the birth of Tammuz. Tammuz, coincidentally, is actually the name of the 4th Hebrew month. So, 25th of December, the birthday of Tammuz. Also, these gods, Ishtar, Semiramis, Tammuz, they all have different names in different religions and different cultures. So, for example, in Greek mythology, you have Adonis and Aphrodite. They're basically Tammuz and Semiramis. They're one and the same, they just have different names. The Romans had different names to them. So they basically are all the same gods. They're all the same false gods, but they originate from the beginning. They all originate from Babylon, don't they? This is why we have all these different gods in different religions. They're basically all the same, but they have different names depending on which religion or culture we're talking about. Now, you often see images of a female god, a goddess, holding a child, don't you? It doesn't matter what religion it is. You always see images of a female deity holding a child. Now, of course, that also has come from Catholicism. You often see images of the Divine Mary, the Virgin Mary, holding up Jesus. Well, it all comes from Tammuz and Semiramis. That's where it all comes from. And then again, every culture and every religion has its own version, but it all comes from Babylon. It all comes from the Babylonian religion. Something else you have at Christmas time is the Roman festival of Saturnalia. Saturnalia. It's in between the 17th and 23rd of December. So not actually on the 25th, it's 17th and 23rd of December. However, it's very close, and therefore that's why it's closely associated with Christmas. Now, some of the practices that they used to do in the Feast of Saturnalia has made its way into Christmas. For example, wreaths, the laying of wreaths. That is a Roman practice which they used to do at the festival of Saturnalia. So that is something which is pagan in origin. However, what about the Christmas tree? Again, Christians often ask this time of year, should we be having Christmas trees in our homes? Now, it's often said that they celebrated the birth of Tammuz on the 25th of December by decorating trees and putting trees up in their homes. Now, there's not really any real historical record of that. However, it was a common practice to decorate trees in people's homes in pagan times. This was because the pagans used to worship trees. They used to think trees were sacred because of the life and things that it represents. You know, especially trees that were green all year round. They used to decorate trees and worship them. Not just on the 25th of December. It was just a pagan practice in general. So yes, the putting up and decorating of trees is a pagan practice, but it's not associated exclusively with the birth of Tammuz. It is just a pagan practice which was often done in pagan times. Now, of course, there is a verse in the Bible which people often refer to refute the idea that we should be that we shouldn't be having Christmas trees in our homes, and that, of course, comes from Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 3 to 4. For the customs of the people are futile, for one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. So this is often used as a proof text to not have Christmas trees in our homes. However, we do need to understand that the whole context of Jeremiah and also many of the prophets such as Isaiah, etc., is talking against idolatry, is talking against idols, and this is how they used to make idols. They used to cut down trees, and then from the trunk they would then carve an idol out of it. So it says here, how it is the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They used to carve an idol out of this wood, and then what they used to do is they used to overlay it with molten silver or gold. So that's how they used to make a silver or gold idol. And then what they'd do is they'd hammer it down with nails so that it would be fixed in its position, maybe on the wall or on a shelf or something, and of course bow down and worship it. This is how they used to make idols. It's not necessarily talking about the idea of cutting down a tree and then hanging gold and silver like tinsel and decorations and things like this. Now, it does say they used to decorate it with silver and gold. The Hebrew word there for decorate is yafa, and it literally means to make beautiful. The Hebrew word for beautiful is yafeh. So they used to overlay it with molten silver or gold. So basically these idols will be made of wood, but they're gold plated or silver plated. That is how they used to make idols. So that's what this verse is literally talking about. It's not necessarily talking about Christmas trees as we know it. It's just talking about how they used to make idols by chopping down trees and then carving from the trunk an idol, an image or something, and then overlaying it with molten silver or gold. That's exactly how they used to make idols. Now, what about the idea of Santa Claus? Of course, Santa Claus, the word Santa Claus comes from a Dutch word, funny enough, but Santa Claus is based on this story of St. Nicholas. Now, St. Nicholas was a bishop or a pastor of a church in Ephesus who had a love for poor people and children. And one of the things that St. Nicholas used to do was go into people's homes at night time and leave gifts. He did this for a particular family, a father who had 3 daughters, I believe, and he used to leave bags of gold coins, money, in their homes. Now, one night it was said as well that the father actually stayed up late to try and catch who was ever doing this, and that's something kids often do. They often stay up late to try and catch Santa Claus in their lounge laying presents out in front of the tree, don't they? So that's where the story of Santa Claus comes from. It comes from St. Nicholas, who was a Christian and did good things. So what is behind the story of Santa Claus is 100% Christian. It's simply a guy who had a love for the poor, a love for children, and used to secretly leave gifts in these people's homes. However, it got morphed into the idea of this God who can see everything you're doing, and if you're not well behaved, then he's not going to bring you anything. So the idea that there's this omnipresent God who can see everything that you're doing and that you have to work hard to please in order to receive rewards. This is something we shouldn't be teaching children. If you're a Christian, you cannot be teaching your child that there's another God out there who's going to reward you if you behave yourself and you can see everything you're doing. That is idolatry. That is teaching children false religion. If you're bringing your child up in the ways of the Lord, in the ways of the Bible, to teach them that there's one God, then how confusing for a child to then teach them that there's this other God who can see everything you're doing and he's going to reward you if you behave, or if you don't behave, then he's not going to bring you anything. How confusing for a child. We cannot be teaching Christian children the idea of Santa Claus. We can teach them, of course, charitable good deeds and things like this, things that St. Nicholas did, but we certainly can't be teaching children that there are other gods out there who's going to reward you if you behave. This is not of God. Another area of division, of course, is when was Christ actually born? Now, we know that he wasn't born on the 25th of December. We do know from calculations which are taken from 1 Chronicles 24 and Luke chapter 1, that you can narrow it down between the last week in September and the first week of October. You can narrow it down that closely in the Bible. The birth of Christ would have been the last week in September and the first week in October. So anywhere in between that. So that incidentally would have been the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's quite fitting that Jesus would have been born during the Feast of Tabernacles, in that John chapter 1 says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word there, dwelt, literally means to tabernacle. Some translations say the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So Jesus came to live among us, and therefore it's only fitting that he should be born during the Feast of Tabernacles. This is when the birth of Christ actually would have been. It's not on the 25th of December. The 25th of December is the birthday of Tammuz, the Babylonian god. The birth of Christ would have been anywhere between the last week in September and the first week in October. That's when Christ was actually born. Now, of course, there's the flip side of the argument, which obviously gets quoted quite a lot from Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. You also have Romans chapter 14, verses 5 to 7. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. The story of the birth of Christ, the nativity, is biblical. That's not pagan in origin. The story of the birth of Christ is 100% biblical, taken of course from Matthew chapters 1 and 2, taken from Luke chapter 1. The story of the birth of Christ, the nativity, is completely biblical. So what gets celebrated at Christmas is biblical, the birth of Christ. And we should remember the birth of Christ. There's nothing commanding us to celebrate the birth of Christ, but there's also nothing commanding us to not celebrate it. It's a good thing to remember the birth of Christ. Now, of course, on the flip side of the argument, there are so many churches who are against Christmas and against these kind of things, and that's all well and good. But because they're so against it, the narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and Luke 1, never gets taught. They never teach on the birth of Christ, when they should be teaching on the birth of Christ. Why? A, because it's biblical, it's straight from the Bible, and B, because these things are a picture of what's going to happen as well. The first coming of Christ foreshadows the second coming. So there's things about the nativity, there's things about the birth of Christ which we need to understand, and we do need to be teaching these things. Now, you don't have to teach these things at Christmas time. Teach them any time you like. If you want to truly celebrate and remember the birth of Jesus, then do it during the Feast of Tabernacles. That's when he was actually born. However, people this time of year are thinking about spiritual things. They are thinking about the things of the Bible. They are thinking about Jesus. Even though they're going out spending hundreds of pounds, which they haven't got, on all kinds of junk which people don't need, people are still thinking about this time of year, especially when I would say the Queen's speech, but this year it's going to be the King's speech for the first time. The King's speech is going to be Christ-centered. They talk about Jesus on the Queen's or King's speech. Therefore, it's a good opportunity to tell people that this time of year that they're thinking about, they are thinking about a festival which has to do with Jesus. It's a good opportunity to point them to Jesus. It's a good opportunity to remind them why they're doing what they're doing. Even though Christmas historically has nothing to do with Christ, many of the practices which has made its way into Christmas has nothing to do with Christ. It comes from paganism. It's still a good opportunity to tell people that what they're doing this time of year is about Jesus. So take that opportunity to tell people about Jesus, and ultimately to tell them to repent and to come to the one true God. So thank you very much, brothers and sisters, for listening to this study, and I hope that has clarified any misunderstandings or confusion in regard to Christmas. Please do get in touch with us if you have any questions. God bless you all.